Thank you very much, respected Federal Chancellor. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very grateful for the invitation to such a distinguished conference that has brought together politicians, military personnel, entrepreneurs, and experts from more than 40 countries around the world. The format of this conference allows me to avoid excessive politeness and the necessity of speaking in roundabout, pleasant, but empty diplomatic clichés. The conference format allows me to say what I really think about international security issues. If my thoughts seem overly provocative or inaccurate to our colleagues, I ask that you do not hold it against me. After all, this is just a conference, and I hope that after 2 or 3 minutes of my speech, Mr. Telchik will not turn on the red light. It is known that the problems of international security extend far beyond issues of military political stability. They include the stability of the global economy, overcoming poverty, economic security, and the development of intercivilizational dialogue. This comprehensive and indivisible nature of security is expressed in its basic principle: the security of each is the security of all. As Franklin Roosevelt said in the early days of World War II, where peace has been broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. These words remain relevant today. This, by the way, is evidenced by the theme of our conference, which is written here: Global Crises, Global Responsibility. Just 2 decades ago, the world was ideologically and economically divided, and its security was ensured by the vast strategic potentials of 2 superpowers. Global confrontation pushed extremely acute economic and social issues to the periphery of international relations. And like any war, the Cold War left us with unexploded ordnance, so to speak, in the form of ideological stereotypes, double standards, and other remnants of bloc thinking. The proposed unipolar world after the Cold War also did not materialize. Human history, of course, knows periods of unipolar states and aspirations for world domination. There have been many such instances in human history. However, what is a unipolar world? However much this term is adorned, it ultimately means in practice only one thing: one center of power, one center of force, one center of decision-making. It is a world of one master, one sovereign. And this is ultimately destructive not only for all within this system but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys it from within. And this has nothing in common with democracy, because democracy, as is known, is the rule of the majority while taking into account the interests and opinions of the minority. Incidentally, Russia is constantly being taught about democracy, but those who teach us are somehow reluctant to learn themselves. I believe that for the modern world, the unipolar model is not only unacceptable but also impossible. Not only because with single-handed leadership in the contemporary world, there will be insufficient military, political or economic resources, but more importantly, the model itself does not work as it has no and can have no moral ethical basis for modern civilization. At the same time, everything happening in the world today, and we have just begun to discuss this, is a consequence of attempts to implement precisely this concept in world affairs, the concept of a unipolar world. And what is the result? Unilateral, illegitimate, and often actions have not solved any problems. Moreover, they have become a generator of new human tragedies and hotbeds of tension. Judge for yourselves, the number of wars and local and regional conflicts has not decreased. Mr. Telchik mentioned this very gently. The number of people dying in these conflicts is not decreasing, on the contrary, it is increasing, significantly increasing. Today, we are witnessing almost unrestrained, hypertrophied use of force in international affairs, military force. The application of force in the world is leading from one conflict to another. Consequently, there is not enough strength for a comprehensive resolution of any of them, making their political solutions impossible. We are witnessing an increasing disregard for the fundamental principles of international law. Moreover, individual norms, indeed almost the entire legal system of one state, primarily, of course, the United States, have extended beyond its national borders and are being imposed on other states in all spheres: economy, politics, and the humanitarian field. Who would like that? Who would like that? In international affairs, there is an increasing tendency to resolve issues based on so-called political expediency, founded on current political circumstances. This is extremely dangerous and leads to a situation where no one feels safe anymore. I want to emphasize this: no one feels safe anymore because no one can hide behind international law like a stone wall. Such a policy is, of course, a catalyst for the arms race. The dominance of the force factor inevitably fuels the desire of several countries to possess weapons of self-destruction. Moreover, new threats that were previously known have now acquired a global character, such as terrorism. I am convinced that we have reached a critical moment where we must seriously reconsider the entire architecture of global security. Here, we need to seek a reasonable balance between the interests of all subjects of international relations, especially now when the international landscape is changing so noticeably and rapidly. This is happening due to the dynamic development of a number of states and regions. The Federal Chancellor has already mentioned this: the combined GDP of India and China at purchasing power parity is already greater than that of the United States. Calculated by the same principle, the GDP of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, exceeds the combined GDP of the European Union. And according to expert estimates, this gap will only continue to grow in the foreseeable historical perspective. There is no doubt that the economic potential of new centers of global growth will inevitably be converted into political influence and will strengthen multipolarity. In this context, the role of multilateral diplomacy, openness, transparency, and predictability of policies significantly increases. The use of force should indeed be an exceptional measure, just like the death penalty in the legal systems of some states. Today, however, we observe a situation where countries that prohibit the death penalty even for murderers and other dangerous criminals easily participate in military operations that are hard to call legitimate. Yet, in these conflicts, hundreds and thousands of civilians die. However, the question arises: should we passively and helplessly watch various internal conflicts in certain countries, the actions of authoritarian regimes, tyrants, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? This question was essentially the basis of the one posed to the Federal Chancellor by our esteemed colleague Mr. Lee Gorman. Can we look passively at what is happening? I'll try to answer this question too. Of course, we should not look passively. Absolutely not. But do we have the means to counter these threats? Of course, we do. One only needs to remember recent history. There was a peaceful transition to democracy in our country. There was a peaceful transformation of the Soviet regime. A peaceful transformation of what kind of regime with what amount of weaponry, including nuclear weapons? Why, then, is it now necessary to bomb and shoot at every opportunity? Do we lack political culture, respect for democratic values, and the law, especially in the absence of a threat of mutual destruction? I am convinced that the only mechanism for making decisions on the use of military force as a last resort can be the UN Charter. In this regard, I either misunderstood what was said recently by our colleague, the Minister of Defense of Italy, or he misspoke. In any case, I heard that the use of force can be considered legitimate only if the decision is made by NATO, the European Union, or the United Nations. If he indeed thinks so, then we have different points of view, or I misheard. The use of force can only be considered legitimate if the decision is made based on and within the framework of the UN. There is no need to substitute the United Nations with the European Union or any other organization. When the UN truly unites the forces of the international community and can indeed respond to events in individual countries, when we rid ourselves of the disregard for international law, the situation may change. Otherwise, the situation will only lead to deadlock and multiply grave mistakes. It is also crucial to ensure that international law has a universal character in both understanding and application of norms. We must remember that a democratic approach in politics necessarily involves discussion and meticulous decision-making. Ladies and gentlemen, the potential danger for the stabilization of international relations is linked to the evident stagnation in the area of disarmament. Russia advocates for the resumption of dialogue on this crucial issue. It is important to maintain the stability of the international legal disarmament framework and ensure the continuity of the process of reducing nuclear weapons. We have agreed with the United States to reduce our nuclear arsenals on strategic carriers to 1,700 to 200 nuclear warheads by December 31, 2012. Russia intends to strictly fulfill its obligations and hopes that our partners will act just as transparently and will not keep an extra couple of hundred nuclear warheads for a rainy day. If today the new U.S. Secretary of Defense announces here that the United States will not hide these warheads, neither in storage nor under the pillow, I propose we all stand up and applaud. That would be a very significant statement. Russia strictly adheres to and intends to continue adhering to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the multilateral regime of missile technology control. The principles laid down in these documents are of a universal nature. In this context, I would like to recall that in the 1980s, the USSR and the United States signed a treaty on the elimination of an entire class of intermediate-range and shorter-range missiles. However, this document did not acquire a universal character. Today, a number of countries possess such missiles: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea, India, Iran, Pakistan, Israel, and many other states are developing these systems and planning to deploy them. Only the United States and Russia bear the obligations not to create such weapon systems. It is clear that under these conditions, we must consider ensuring our own security. At the same time, it is crucial to prevent the emergence of new, destabilizing high-tech types of weapons. I'm not even talking about measures to prevent new spheres of confrontation, especially in space. Star Wars, as we know, is no longer science fiction but a reality. Even in the mid-1980s, our American partners have practically intercepted their own satellite. According to Russia, the militarization of space can provoke consequences for the global community that are no less unpredictable than the dawn of the nuclear era. We have repeatedly put forward initiatives aimed at preventing the deployment of weapons in space. Today, I would like to inform you that we have prepared a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. In the near future, it will be sent to our partners as an official proposal. Let's work on this together. Moreover, plans to deploy elements of the missile defense system in Europe should not concern us. Who needs another round of the inevitable arms race in this case? I highly doubt that the Europeans themselves do. There are no missiles with a range of 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers that could realistically threaten Europe from any so-called problem countries, and they are not expected to appear in the foreseeable future. Even a hypothetical launch of a North Korean missile over Western Europe towards the United States clearly contradicts the laws of ballistics. As we say in Russia, it is like trying to reach your left ear with your right hand by going around your head. Being here in Germany, I cannot fail to mention the crisis state of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, CAFE. The adapted CAFE Treaty was signed in 1999, reflecting the new geopolitical reality and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. 7 years have passed since then, and only 4 states, including the Russian Federation, have ratified this document. NATO countries have openly stated that they will not ratify the treaty, including the provisions on flank limitations, until Russia withdraws its bases from Georgia and Moldova. Our troops are being withdrawn from Georgia, even ahead of schedule, and these issues have been resolved with our Georgian colleagues, as everyone knows. In Moldova, there remains a contingent of 1,500 servicemen performing peacekeeping functions and guarding ammunition depots left over from the Soviet era. We discuss this issue constantly with Mr. Solana, who knows our position, and we are ready to continue working in this direction. But what is happening at the same time? At the same time, so-called light American forward bases with 5,000 troops each are appearing in Bulgaria and Romania. It turns out that NATO is moving its forward forces to our national borders, while we, strictly adhering to the treaty, do not respond to these actions. It is clear that the process of NATO expansion has nothing to do with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it is a seriously provocative factor that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have every right to ask against whom this expansion is directed. What happened to the assurances given by Western partners after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are these promises now? No one even remembers them. But I will remind this audience. I would like to quote from a speech by NATO Secretary-General Mr. Werner in Brussels on May 17, 1990. He said then that the very fact that we are ready not to deploy NATO troops outside the territory of the Forge gives the Soviet Union firm security guarantees. Where are these guarantees? The stones and concrete blocks of the Berlin Wall have long been taken as souvenirs, but we must not forget that its fall was made possible in part by the historical choice of our people, the people of Russia, in favor of democracy, freedom, openness, and sincere partnership with all members of the greater European family. Now, however, we are being confronted with new dividing lines, walls, albeit virtual, that still separate and cut through our common space. Will it really take many more years, even decades, and a change of several generations of politicians to dismantle these new walls? Ladies and gentlemen, we unequivocally support the strengthening of the non-proliferation regime. The existing international legal framework allows for the creation of technologies to produce nuclear fuel for peaceful purposes, and many countries rightly wish to develop their own nuclear energy as a basis for their energy independence. However, we also understand that these technologies can be quickly transformed into the production of weapons-grade materials, which causes serious international tension. A clear example of this is the situation with Iran's nuclear program. If the international community does not come up with a reasonable solution to this conflict of interests, the world will continue to be shaken by similar destabilizing crises. There are more threshold countries than just Iran, and we all know this. We will constantly face the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Last year, Russia proposed the creation of multinational uranium enrichment centers. We are open to the idea that such centers can be established not only in Russia but also in other countries where peaceful nuclear energy exists on a legitimate basis. States wishing to develop nuclear energy could be guaranteed fuel through direct participation in the work of these centers, naturally under strict IAEA control. Russia's proposal aligns with the recent initiatives of U.S. President George Bush. I believe that Russia and the United States are objectively and equally interested in tightening the non-proliferation regime for weapons of mass destruction and their delivery systems. Our countries, as leaders in nuclear and missile potential, should take the lead in developing new, stricter measures in the field of non-proliferation. Russia is ready for this work. We are holding consultations with our American friends. Overall, we should be talking about creating an entire system of political levers and economic incentives where states would be interested in not creating their own nuclear fuel cycle facilities but would have the opportunity to develop nuclear energy, strengthening their energy potential. In this regard, let me elaborate on international energy cooperation. The Federal Chancellor also briefly touched upon this topic. In the energy sector, Russia aims to establish unified market principles and transparent conditions for all. It is clear that the price of energy resources should be determined by the market and not be subject to political speculation, economic pressure, or blackmail. We are open to cooperation. Foreign companies participate in our largest energy projects. According to various estimates, up to 26% of oil production in Russia is accounted for by foreign capital. Think about that number, please. But 26% of oil production in Russia involves foreign capital. Try to give me an example of such a wide presence of Russian business in the key sectors of the economies of Western countries. There are no such examples. There are none. I would also remind you of the ratio of investments coming into Russia versus those going out from Russia to other countries. The ratio is approximately 15:1. Here is a clear example of the openness and stability of the Russian economy. Economic security is a field where everyone should adhere to common principles. We are ready to compete fairly, and the Russian economy is increasingly able to do so. This dynamic is objectively assessed by experts and our foreign partners. Recently, Russia's rating in the OECD was raised from risk group 4 to group 3. And I would like to take this opportunity here today in Munich to thank our German colleagues for their assistance in adopting this decision. You know, the process of Russia's accession to the WTO has reached its final stage. I note that this comes after long and difficult negotiations. We often hear words about freedom, about free trade, and about equal opportunities, but for some reason, these principles are applied exclusively to the Russian, market. Another important issue directly affecting global security is the fight against poverty. What is really happening here? On the one hand, financial resources, often substantial, are allocated to aid programs for the poorest countries. But let's be honest, many of us know that these funds are often absorbed by companies from the donor countries themselves. On the other hand, developed countries maintain agricultural subsidies and restrict access to high technologies for others. Let's call things by their proper names: one hand gives charity, while the other not only preserves economic backwardness but also collects profits. The resulting social tension in such depressed regions inevitably leads to the growth of radicalism and extremism, fueling terrorism and local conflicts. If this happens, for example, in the Middle East, where there is an acute perception of the external world as unjust, there arises a risk of global destabilization. It is evident that the leading countries of the world should see this threat and build a more democratic and fair system of economic relations, a system that gives everyone a chance and an opportunity for development. Speaking at a security conference, it is impossible to ignore the activities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. As you know, it was created to consider all aspects of security: military, political, economic, and humanitarian in their interconnection. Today, what do we see in practice? We see that this balance is clearly disturbed. The OSCE is being turned into a vulgar instrument for ensuring the foreign policy interests of one or a group of countries against other countries. For this task, the bureaucratic apparatus of the OSCE, which is in no way connected to the founding states, has been tailored, as have the decision-making procedures and the use of so-called non-governmental organizations, which are formally independent but purposefully funded and therefore controlled. According to the founding documents in the humanitarian sphere, the OSCE is intended to assist member countries, at their request, in complying with international norms in the field of human rights. This is an important task, and we support it. But this does not at all mean interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, especially imposing on them how they should live and develop. It is clear that such interference does not contribute to the maturation of truly democratic states. On the contrary, it makes them dependent and, as a result, politically and economically unstable. We hope that the OSCE will adhere to its direct tasks and build relations with sovereign states based on respect and trust. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to note the following: we very often, and I personally very often, hear calls for Russia from our partners, including European partners, to play a more active role in world affairs. In this regard, allow me to make a small remark: it is unlikely that we need to be pushed and stimulated towards this. Russia is a country with more than 1,000 years of history, and it has almost always had the privilege of conducting an independent foreign policy. We are not going to change this tradition today. At the same time, we clearly see how the world has changed. We realistically assess our own capabilities and potential, and of course, we would also like to deal with responsible and equally independent partners with whom we could work together to build a fair and democratic world order, ensuring security and prosperity in it not for the select few, but for everyone. Thank you for your attention.